This lecture is over sustainable agriculture. When Eric Andrus bought his Vermont farm in 2005, he dreamed of growing wheat and barley because he loved bread and beer. But the land and climate, he discovered, just wouldn't cooperate. His farm, which he named Boundbrook, was nestled within a valley around Lake Champlain in western Vermont, where it is swampy and wet, far too wet for growing cereal crops. Sometimes Andrus would overhear farmers in the local diner joking, "We ought to be growing rice." One day it dawned on him that they were right. In fact, he is one of only a handful of American farmers using an ancient integrated farming method, one that uses multiple species. In Japan it's called agamo, which means integrated rice and duck farming. After growing rice seedlings in a nursery, Andrus and his farmers transfer them to a field in early spring. Then, their baby ducklings arrive, ready to be released into the rice field to do a very important job. Because rice grows so slowly, it can quickly be crowded out and damaged by quick-growing weeds. Farmers can pull these weeds by hand, but this is difficult and tedious. They can use pesticides, but these contaminate the paddy water. Ducklings, on the other hand, do a marvelous and efficient job of controlling the weeds without harming anything. They eat and trample the weeds, avoiding the rice, whose leaves contain abrasive silica, and their small bodies don't crush or knock over the delicate plants. By the time the ducks have grown big enough to damage the rice too has grown big enough that weeds no longer grow and the ducks are no longer needed. The method works well. Andrus's farm is, right now, the largest rice farm in the northeastern United States. At a time when our world population has surpassed a staggering 8.1 billion and is still growing towards 10 or 11 billion, the need to produce even more food has never been so urgent, and many farmers are looking for ways to grow food without damaging the environment that produces it. Andrus's farming method not only produces a profitable crop, but also provides valuable ecosystem services to the area's human and ecological communities. The soil remains nutrient stable, and the growing environment creates new habitats for wildlife. The rice, too, is delicious. And that brings us to key concept number 1. The goal of sustainable agriculture is to raise food without damaging the environment or future productivity while operating ethically with regard to animals, workers, and local communities. Andrus wanted to find an alternative to industrial agriculture as it is commonly practiced because the methods employed have many downsides. Most industrial farms are monocultures of genetically identical crops, and they are raised with synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. Although they do produce a lot of food, they threaten long-term production by degrading soil, depleting and or polluting water, and shrinking the genetic storehouses of crop and animal varieties. Sustainable agriculture, on the other hand, is farming that can be done indefinitely without compromising the environment or future productivity, all while meeting the needs of the farmer and society as a whole. The techniques used will maintain or even enhance the environment, in many cases using farming methods that help build soil rather than deplete it. Farms often achieve this by mimicking the traits of a sustainable ecosystem. They rely on renewable energy and local resources for inputs, and they depend on biodiversity to trap energy, deal with waste, and control pest populations. Sustainable agriculture can be done on a large or small scale, but to be considered sustainable, it must also be economically viable and socially ethical. Workers should be paid a fair wage and the needs of local communities considered. The humane treatment of animals is also seen as a goal of sustainable agriculture. So, like many other farmers pursuing sustainable agriculture, Andrus cultivates his rice according to the methods of organic agriculture. Instead of using synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, organic farmers employ more natural or, quote, organic, unquote, techniques in the growing of crops, such as fertilizing with manure and luring in natural predators to control pests. In addition, genetically modified organisms cannot be grown on organic farms. Organic food is not, quote, chemical-free, unquote, or, quote, pesticide-free, unquote. It is just largely, quote, synthetic chemical-free, unquote. There are even some exceptions to the, quote, all-natural, unquote, rule, since vaccinations, synthetic pheromones that repel pests, and some synthetic cleaners can be used, while some toxic natural substances, such as arsenic, cannot. Organic foods that are certified by the U.S. Department of Agriculture are labeled USDA organic. While there are certainly environmental benefits to growing foods without synthetic pesticides or fertilizers, there are health benefits as well. A 2014 meta-analysis of 343 studies found that, on average, conventionally grown produce has 4 times more synthetic pesticide residue than organic produce, pesticides that can be ingested when the food is eaten. The meta-analysis also showed that some organically grown foods have higher levels of nutrients than conventionally grown crops. However, it is not known whether these differences translate into meaningful health effects. Organic farming can be difficult, especially in the short term. It often has lower short-term yields and higher labor costs, but its environmental benefits keep production going for longer, so long-term productivity is higher and keeps the soil and surrounding ecosystems healthier. The profit margin for organic food is often larger than it is for conventionally grown food as well. Consumers are willing to pay more for it, both because of its consumer and environmental benefits and because sometimes it just tastes better. As Andrus says about his rice, it has different culinary characteristics and a different story than anything else you can sell. And that brings us to infographic number 1. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, sustainable agriculture is farming that uses only limited amounts of non-renewable resources like fossil fuels and does not degrade the environment or the well-being of people or society as a whole. Organic agriculture is a subset of sustainable agriculture that specifies some requirements for raising the crops or animals. Organic farms that have their production methods varied by the U.S. Department of Agriculture are certified organic. And that brings us to key concept number 2. Fertile soil is a diverse ecosystem that is dependent on a wide variety of biotic and abiotic factors. It provides many important ecosystem services. Unfortunately, in many places, soil is lost much more quickly than it forms. So the productivity of farmland is governed by the health of its soil. Without good soil, there is little, if any, terrestrial plant life, and without plant life, there is little life of any kind. Soil is not just a solid mineral matrix in which plant roots are anchored. It is a complex living ecosystem full of a diverse assortment of bacteria, fungi, and invertebrate species that recycle matter and enrich the soil with nutrients. Soil contains open spaces that hold air and water needed by these soil organisms and the plants that grow in the soil. And while the plants rely on the soil that support them, so too does the soil community depend on the plants growing in it. Some species of bacteria and fungi in soil form mutualistic relationships with plant roots. Bacteria and fungi need energy, and they get it from sugars and other carbon molecules exuded from plant roots. These secretions are called exudates. In return, soil organisms provide fixed nitrogen and soluble phosphorus to the plants. And fungi and invertebrates break down biological matter, forming the organic material that supports both plants and soil microbes. The higher the diversity of plants above ground and soil organisms below ground, the better these processes will proceed. The structure of soil is an important part of this relationship. Consider the plant's need for nitrogen. While some plants, known as legumes, form symbiotic relationships with nitrogen-fixing bacteria that live in nodules in the plant's roots, non-leguminous plants depend on free-living bacteria that live in the tiny pores that form between the clumps and lumps of soil for the nitrogen that they need. This environment needs to be just right. The pore sizes can't be too big or too small. Low oxygen levels are required, just the right amount of moisture, and conditions that develop as organic material is decomposed is also important. Known as soil aggregates, these clumps are formed and held in place by a kind of glue produced by the bacteria themselves. So unfortunately, industrial farming methods that depend on heavy soil tilling result in soil compaction and an increased rate of soil erosion. This is a process in which soil is swept away by wind and rain into streams, rivers, and gullies faster than it can be replenished. That's no small matter. Soil formation is a slow process that requires weathering of rock and decomposition of organic material. Though it varies greatly from place to place, it has been estimated that in most places it takes 500 years to more than 1,000 years to generate 1 inch of the precious brown gold in which our food grows. Any action that breaks down the architecture of the soil, that destroys those pores and the glue that helps maintain the soil's three-dimensional structure and exposes the soil to elements, can worsen soil erosion. When farmers ready their fields for planting by plowing to turn the soil and remove weeds or last year's crop residue, they increase the soil's vulnerability to erosion. The loss of these plants, even dead or decaying plant matter, means fewer roots to hold the soil in place and fewer nutrients returning to the soil. Erosion can remove in days what took decades to form. So soil also plays a role in our groundwater quality. As water soaks into the ground, the part that passes through the soil is, quote, filtered, unquote. That is, filtered enough to be drinkable without further treatment from wells that are deep enough. Soils are also one of the most important carbon sinks. They hold more than the atmosphere or all of the world's vegetation. This makes soil a key player in mitigating climate change. Soils vary in quality, as anyone who has tried to grow a garden knows. The texture of the soil is important and is determined by the size of the mineral particles that make it up and the amount of organic material mixed in. Sandy soils predominantly have large particles. Roots can pass through these loose soils easily, but they do not offer good structural support to plants. In addition, water drains through these soils easily, leaving them dry much of the time. The smallest particles, which Andrus knows well, are clay. The soil surrounding his farm is composed largely of clay, a heavily weathered soil that will hold more water than other types of soil. But the small particles can pack very tightly, making the soil so dense that roots have a hard time penetrating it. Therefore, clay makes great bricks, but poor soil for plant growth. But with the right techniques, this kind of soil works well for growing water-loving rice. Silt particles are smaller than sand, but larger than clay. Silty soils are a nice compromise between sand and clay, offering structural support for root systems, but also allowing water to percolate through at a rate that is more suitable for plants. Still, a soil made up from entirely silt would not be highly productive. In general, the best soil for plant growth is one with even proportions of large, medium, and small particles. These soils have enough clay to bind and keep water and nutrients in the soil, enough sand to help some water drain away, and enough silt to strike a balance between the other two. So a closer look at a soil's profile sometimes reveals distinct layers called horizons that reflect the formation process. Soil layers represent the dual nature of soil formation. The weathering of rock beneath the soil is the C horizon, and the deposition of organic material such as leaf litter at the top is the O horizon. This surface litter is broken down by soil organisms, that is, microorganisms and invertebrates such as worms, insects, and fungi, in the process of decomposition. This releases nutrients into the A horizon, that is, the soil level where plant roots are most densely packed. The upper level of the A horizon is the most fertile region of soil. It is known as topsoil. The loss of the O and A horizons due to soil erosion or intentional removal impoverishes the soil by removing not only the nutrient-rich soil, but also living organisms that help produce it. Fires that burn hot enough to kill soil organisms greatly impede ecosystem recovery. Transplanting a thin layer of soil from healthy grasslands to barren land, known as soil inoculation, helps replace the missing microbes and invertebrates that form the soil community, sustainably speeding up the recovery of the area. Protecting or repairing damaged farmland ultimately then comes down to restoring soil and soil fertility. The use of industrial fertilizers is a temporary fix that can eventually reduce soil fertility even more. Turning to nature, that is, emulating how natural ecosystems recycle nutrients and keep soil fertile, is an option gaining traction on farm fields and pastures everywhere. And that brings us to key concept number 3, modeling a farm after an ecosystem, agroecology, to include a variety of plants and animals can boost productivity and protect or even enhance the local environment. So long before Andrus bought Bound Brook Farm, another rice farmer was uncovering the ancient secrets of rice and duck farming in Japan. Takeo Furuno had been, by most standards, a very successful industrial rice farmer with annual yields among the highest in southern Japan. But it was a tough grind. Each year he was forced to put much of his earnings back into next year's crops, insecticides, herbicides, irrigation, and fertilizer, so that despite his success, he and his family were left with very little for themselves at the end of each season. Then in the late 1970s, he transitioned to organic farming, but seemed to be fighting a losing battle against the pests that ate his rice and the weeds that outcompeted his paddies. In searching for a better way, he turned, as he often did, to his forebears to see what he could learn from their knowledge. That was when he first heard about rice and duck farming, and initially he was surprised. Like most other rice farmers, Furuno considered ducks a pest. Adult ducks eat rice seeds before they have a chance to grow, and as ducks forage, they trample young seedlings into the mud. This disturbance creates open patches of water, which in turn invites more ducks. But ducklings, Furuno soon realized, were too small to do such damage. For one thing, their bills were not big enough or strong enough to extract rice seeds from the mud. Instead, they ate bugs and snails, pests that eat rice, and weeds, other plants that compete with rice for space and nutrients. Furuno's forebears also grew a fish called the pond loach in their paddies. The loach's waste provides nutrients rice can use, and the fish can be harvested and sold as food. Together, the ducklings and loaches would keep the weeds from strangling the rice crop, but Furuno noticed that if the animals did their job well, they soon ran out of food. To combat this, he began adding azolla to the rice paddy, a small fern-like plant that grows on the surface of the water. In the early stages of rice farming, azolla is considered a harmful weed, one that grows quickly and crowds out the rice. But when introduced after the rice plants are well established, azolla provides food for the ducks without competing with the rice for soil nutrients, and because it is a legume that contains symbiotic bacteria that produce a usable form of nitrogen, it helps fertilize the rice. In fact, between the nitrogen from the azolla and the duck and fish droppings, Furuno found that he no longer needed to spend money on fertilizer. And in an unexpected benefit, Furuno found that the action of ducklings swimming around the rice plants strengthened the root crowns, that is, where the root meets the stem, allowing each plant to produce more rice. Furuno's operation is an elegant example of biomimicry, that is, a farm operating like a natural ecosystem. This type of farming is known as agroecology. This is a holistic approach that considers the local ecology of the area, the value of traditional farming methods, and the socio-economic needs of the local community. Agroecology comes with many benefits compared with industrial farming. For one thing, it uses fewer chemicals, that is, fertilizers and pests. It also saves money and reduces the environmental damage. Biodiversity is often enhanced and the system self-regulates so the farmer doesn't have to micromanage the operations. And because nature performs some of the tasks that would otherwise require machinery powered by fossil fuels, these systems also tend to have lower greenhouse gas emissions. Furuno found that there were financial gains too. Duck eggs, duck meat, and fish all fetched a good price in the market. And because he was no longer using pesticides, Furuno could also grow fruit on the edges of his rice field. He opted for fig trees since he could harvest the figs annually without having to replant. So Furuno's integrated farm is an example of polyculture. That is, intentionally raising more than one species on a given plot of land. In the decades since Furuno began rice and duck farming, his rice yields have increased by as much as 50%, making his among the most productive farms in the world. This kind of success is especially important for farmers in many developing countries who struggle to produce enough food for current populations. Increasing production with lesser dependence on expensive inputs and using methods that enhance rather than diminish environmental quality can help communities become more self-sufficient and help them achieve food security. Another example of an integrated farm gaining popularity is an approach known as aquaponics. Here, crops and fish are raised together in a system that cycles water between fish tanks and crops. Plants are grown in the hydroponics systems, meaning that they are grown in water rather than in soil. The fish waste products provides nutrients for the plants, and the plants filter the water so that it can be returned to the fish tanks. Aquaponics can be done on large scales in warehouses or outdoor areas or on small scales as benchtop hobbies. Such operations are found in almost every state, in urban centers such as Chicago and Detroit, and in small towns across rural America. And that brings us to infographic number 3. Furuno's farm is a self-regulating, multiple species system that naturally meets the needs of the farm ecosystem. All of the species play a role in the system, helping each other and boosting overall production. And in this slide, we see the final product, which is an integrated system. And that brings us to key concept number 4. Integrated pest management techniques can often effectively control pests while minimizing or eliminating the use of chemical pesticides. So in sustainable agriculture, farmers need to control pests without causing additional harm. They might try to do so by reducing or foregoing the use of pesticides, which minimizes the load of toxic substances on our food and in the environment and reduces the likelihood that pesticide resistance will develop. Pesticides are problematic for another reason. They often kill non-target species such as honeybees or beetles that play a role in the ecosystem and may even be helpful to the farmer. Honeybees pollinate, while beetles can make natural predators for crop pests. Andrus's weed control methods of employing ducks and natural predators and removing weeds by hand are examples of integrated pest management, or the use of a variety of methods to help reduce a pest population. The goal of an integrated pest management system is to successfully control pests while minimizing or eliminating the use of chemical toxins. First, the farmer must examine the life cycle of the pest and the pest's interactions with the environment to identify the best way to deal with the pest. In general, integrated pest management techniques fall into 4 categories: biological control, cultural control, mechanical control, and chemical control. So, biological control involves using other species to keep the pest populations in check. This is Andrus's approach, with the ducks as natural predators of insects and weeds. When farmers use cultural control, they plant their crop in such a way as to limit pest infestations. This might involve planting a variety of crops together in a polyculture to reduce the pest's food supply. With mechanical control, farmers employ methods that either physically exclude pests, such as nets or row covers, or remove or trap pests. In 2015, Andrus, with support from the organization SARE, that is Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education, compared the efficacy of using either ducks or azolla as biological controls or hand weeding as a mechanical control to minimize the growth of weeds in his rice paddies. He found that the ducks worked best. In some cases, they were 100% more effective than hand weeding alone. When devising an integrated pest management plan, farmers use a combination of biological, cultural, and mechanical controls to deal with pest problems, and they resort to using chemicals only if these methods don't adequately deter the pests. If a pesticide is going to be used, the preference is for natural, biodegradable chemicals that are toxic only to a limited group of organisms. For example, pyrethrum, a compound naturally produced by a flower in the chrysanthemum family, is directly toxic to insects but not to mammals. It is certified for organic agriculture because it is naturally produced, not a synthetic human creation, and because it breaks down quickly and does not linger in the environment. However, while it kills insect pests, it is also toxic to good insects like honeybees, so its use is avoided during times of pollination. Synthetic pesticides, like those commonly used in industrial agriculture, are not acceptable for use on certified organic crops, but may be a part of an integrated pest management plan for conventionally raised crops. And that brings us to infographic number 4. Controlling pests is important for our agricultural yields as well as for our health and for the health of our pets. Rather than using harsh methods in an attempt to completely eliminate the pest, which rarely works anyway, a combination of less hazardous methods can often reduce pest numbers to manageable levels. And that brings us to key concept number 5. Sustainable agriculture draws on a variety of traditional farming methods that can protect and or improve soil and or reduce pest problems. So farmers have a variety of traditional methods, those used long before industrial methods emerged, to choose from to meet the needs of their crops, many of which are responsive to the local environment. These methods will help prevent soil erosion, maintain or even improve soil fertility, and control pests. As discussed in Section 2, healthy soil is vital to life on Earth. It supports the growth of plants as well as the animals that feed on those plants. However, its slow rate of formation cannot keep up with losses that result from modern farming. David Montgomery, a researcher at the University of Washington, estimates that soil erosion from industrial agriculture exceeds soil formation by 100-fold. As much as 5 tons of topsoil are lost for every ton of industrial-produced grain in the United States. On the other hand, some traditional methods help restore or protect the soil. For example, methods such as terracing, contour farming, and reduced tillage cultivation can decrease soil erosion. Even though Andrus's fields are exceptionally flat, he still uses terracing to get his paddies just right. Other traditional methods include the planting of a cover crop in the off-season, a practice that prevents soil erosion and, if the crop is chosen, restores fertility. Soil fertility can also be enhanced and pests controlled using crop rotation and strip cropping. And systems like Furunos that combine animal and plant rearing return animal waste, a natural fertilizer, to the soil. In addition to these traditional farming methods, farmers have long added substances to the soil to improve its fertility. Fertilizers, natural or synthetic, organic matter to loosen compacted soil, and substances such as lime to alter the pH of the soil are all soil amendments that can be added to address fertility problems. Synthetic fertilizers can increase levels of a particular nutrient beyond what might be found in a natural fertilizer, though this can upset the mutualistic relationship between the growing plant and the soil microbes that normally provide nutrients to the plant. Natural fertilizers like manure or biochar, which is a form of charcoal produced when organic matter is partially burned, rarely upset the soil community in this way since they do not contain excessive amounts of nutrients. Farmers can minimize the use of fertilizers altogether through a technique known as microfertilization, which involves adding just the amount required and no more to the specific plants that need it. Rather than working on ways to improve the soil, Wes Jackson and a team of dedicated scientists at the Land Institute in Kansas are pursuing an ambitious plan that he says will correct a mistake made well before the rise of industrial farming. He wants to replace virtually all of our existing grain crops, which are annual crops, with perennial crop varieties. Early farmers domesticated annual plants, which grow, produce seeds, and die in a single year, because they could manipulate them to produce higher yields from one year to the next by crossbreeding plants with the best traits. But annuals must be replanted every season, which requires labor and fossil fuel energy and necessitates tearing up the ground and disrupting the delicate balance of the soil ecosystems. Perennials, on the other hand, can be harvested year after year without disturbing the soil to replant, which means heavy equipment is used less often to manage perennial crops. Perennial plants hold a considerable amount of carbon in their roots, providing the valuable ecosystem service of carbon sequestration. And the deep roots that perennials develop not only hold the soil in place, but also trap much farther down into the soil rather than annual counterparts, allowing them to access more of the soil's water, thus dramatically reducing the amount of irrigation needed. Less herbicide is needed for perennial plots as well. Weeds do not readily sprout and grow among the established plants. This makes perennials especially attractive for regions with marginal land or an arid climate. And that brings us to infographic 5. So for this infographic, there's a series of slides, so we'll go through them one by one. Contour farming is when farming on hilly land, rows are planted along the slope following the lay of the land, rather than oriented downhill to reduce the loss of water and soil after a rainfall. And the next one is reduced tillage. This is the planting of crops into soil that is minimally tilled, and this reduces soil erosion and water needs because it reduces water evaporation. It also requires less fuel because of less tractor use. And that brings us to terrace farming. So on steep slopes, the land can be leveled into steps. This reduces soil erosion and allows a crop like rice to stay flooded when needed. Crop rotation is the next one. Planting different crops on a given plot of land every few years helps maintain soil fertility and reduces pest outbreaks, since pests or their offspring from the year before will not find a suitable food when they emerge in the new season. Well, there is a farm field right behind my building, and they rotate crops every year. So every season they switch their crops. They're constantly switching between corn and soybeans because the soybeans are going to fix the nitrogen in the soil, and the corn uses the nitrogen to help it grow. The next one is strip cropping. That is alternating different crops in strips that are several rows wide to keep pest populations low. It is less likely the pests will travel beyond the edge of a strip, and they may not find another row of this crop. Yeah, it sounds like there's some logical fallacies in that reasoning, but I guess it works. And finally, there's cover crops. So during the off season, rather than letting a field stand bare, a crop can be planted that will hold the soil in place. Nitrogen-fixing crops like alfalfa that improve the soil are often chosen. And that brings us to key concept number 6. Consumer choices can support sustainable agriculture. Buying locally grown organic food is the best option for reducing the carbon footprint of that food. So the rice varieties that Andrus grows on his farm are Japanese short grain varieties, delicious when served alongside other foods or when used to make sushi. Andrus wanted to create a farm that contributed to the formation of a local community food system, and he sells his rice direct from his farm to consumers who visit, as well as wholesale distributors who sell his rice in specialty grocery stores. More and more, consumers are buying food from local farmers. Local agriculture supports local economies and provides fresher and thus healthier food to consume. Because transportation depends on fossil fuels, the more food miles a product travels before reaching the consumer, the greater the carbon footprint of that food. And much of our own food has traveled quite far, around 1,500 miles on average. However, transportation is not the main use of fossil fuels when crops are raised industrially. Research by Christopher Weber and Scott Matthews of Carnegie Mellon University determined that about 90% of the carbon footprint for food grown using conventional industrial methods is from the production of the crop. That is fuel for equipment, raw materials for pesticides, and fertilizer production, not its transport. Therefore, buying organically grown produce, even from far away, may reduce the carbon footprint more so than buying locally grown industrial crops. Of course, the best option is to choose organic foods that are locally grown. Likewise, because beef raised in high-density industrial operations has one of the highest carbon footprints of all agricultural products, one of the best things you can do is replace at least some of the beef you eat with chicken, pork, fish, or meatless dishes. Consumers are becoming more aware that things like food miles and the way food is raised matter for the environment, their communities, and their own health. Organic foods and ethically raised animal products are claiming a bigger share of consumer dollars annually. But this has opened the door to greenwashing, that is, making claims about the environmental benefits of sustainably raised or organic foods that are misleading. For example, organic cookies are probably not healthier than those made with conventional ingredients, and cage-free eggs may still come from chickens living in overcrowded conditions. Consumers need to be diligent about evaluating claims and make informed decisions about what to purchase. This is one reason why foods need meaningful, trustworthy labels so consumers can know how the food was raised and whether it conforms to their personal preferences and values. And that brings us to infographic number 6. Because the growing and transport of our food impacts the environment and our own health so much, choosing foods produced in a way that has a lower impact makes a difference. This also supports sustainable agriculture as an economic endeavor, helping the farmers and communities pursuing these methods. Moving on, if you can't afford to buy all organic produce, consider steering your purchases away when you are able from the, quote, dirty dozen, unquote, the 12 fruits and vegetables most likely to be contaminated with pesticide residue. The quote, clean 15, unquote, are the products least likely to have pesticide residue. So if you can't afford to buy all organic produce, buy these from the regular produce shelf. But always wash all produce well before eating or cooking. And that brings us to key concept number 7. Sustainable agriculture comes with trade-offs, but many feel that the disadvantages are less problematic than those of modern industrial agriculture, especially in the long term. Andrus and Furuno are not the only ones experimenting with nature-based polyculture. Indeed, many other farmers and scientists in the United States and beyond are turning to agroecology, that is, working to develop polyculture systems that use a mix of different species that better replicates the normal ecological community makeup of a given region. Evidence is mounting that such systems can increase a farm's productivity. So a 2010 report by the International Livestock Research Institute concluded that mixed polyculture farms, that is, ones like Furuno's and Andrus's, grow both plants and livestock, hold the most promise for intensifying food production worldwide. Feeding a world of 10 billion people will not be easy. It will require a combination of modern industrial and traditional techniques, native crop varieties, and perhaps genetically modified ones. The methods and crops chosen should fit the place and need of the farmers and their communities. But consideration needs to be given to the long-term viability of the farm, with preference given to techniques that maintain or improve the health of the ecosystem. As these many examples, agroecology, the resurrection of traditional farming methods, integrated pest management plans, and the development of perennial crops illustrate a multitude of methods that are available to help facilitate a transition from the current industrial agricultural model to methods that are more sustainable. Of course, with all environmental choices, it shouldn't be surprising that sustainable and organic agriculture have their own set of trade-offs. However, addressing these trade-offs may be more feasible than dealing with the disadvantages of large-scale industrial monocultures. For Andrus, the decision to incorporate ducklings into his Vermont farm was part of an ongoing search for solutions to the challenges of modern rice farming. And he continues to experiment in order to find new and better approaches. This year, for instance, he plans to build a remote-controlled weeding drone to try out in shallow areas of his paddies, which his ducklings tend to avoid, and then gets overrun with weeds. And that brings us to our core message for this chapter. Food security for all people requires a sustainable food system, and there are 2 goals for this. 1, to grow crops without degrading the ecosystem that supports that growth, and 2, to change consumer purchasing practices to support sustainable agriculture. So let's summarize our chapter. Polycultures that integrate multiple species are a viable method of sustainable farming. Relying on indigenous knowledge can match the farm to the local community. Sustainable farming has to both feed the people and maintain or improve the health of the land. Mimicking natural ecosystems is beneficial to both people and the land.